I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Scientists are seeing signals that COVID-19's alarming Omicron wave may have peaked in Britain and is about to do the same in the U.S., at which point cases may start dropping off dramatically. The reason is because the variant has proved to be so wildly contagious that it may already be running out of people to infect, just a month and a half after it was first detected in South Africa. Dr. David Heyman, the former head of the World Health Organization's Infectious Diseases Department, says Britain is the closest to any country of being out of the pandemic, and that COVID-19 is inching towards becoming endemic. Ali Mokdad, a professor of health metrics sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle, says Omicron is going to come down as fast as it went up. So will this be the same case for Canada? Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me.
So some promising news here, Dr. Raut, but let's start with a quick overview of how many Canadians have been infected with Omicron so far.
Yeah, so Canada has documented more cases of COVID-19 via Omicron in the first 40 days than it did in the entire first year of the pandemic. There have been more than 777,000 cases of new confirmed infections of Omicron, and which started at the end of November. In contrast, it took us 370 days to get that same number when we had that first case of COVID-19 in January 25th, 2020. There have also been more than 4 times the number of active cases now than during the peak of the second or third waves in the winter and spring of last year.
So that's very interesting, Dr. Raut. Do you think Canada is at its peak of infections just as Britain may be?
I think we may be entering soon into the place where we'll start to see a decline. Keep in mind, it's very difficult to know when a peak is happening. You literally have to wait until it passes. Having said that, we do have factors we look at to see if a peak is nearing. We look at tests in the community, positivity rates of these tests, and also wastewater analysis. Looking at these 3 indicators, we think we might be nearing a peak, likely in a few weeks. But remember, these are just estimates, but we're very hopeful we'll get there soon.
Hopeful indeed, Dr. Raut. Well, if we reach this peak, will Canada reach this endemic level, as some doctors are speculating about Britain?
Right. I appreciate the underlying question here is, when is this all going to end? And I think the good news here is most experts agree that it will end. We may not totally be able to eradicate COVID-19, but we'll see it move out into an endemic phase rather than a pandemic phase. When we see endemic, what that means is there aren't these crazy large spikes up and down. The reproductive number of the disease is actually very small and also very consistent. We are nowhere near that right now. We still have massive fluctuations and peaks. However, the hope is that we will see these numbers stabilize in the future.
And Omicron is not the first variant of the coronavirus, so how likely are we to see another virus variant pop up and cause an infectious wave following Omicron?
Viruses, especially coronaviruses, are always mutating. Most of the time, these mutations don't change much about a virus, and so we don't even classify it as a variant of concern. But sometimes these multiple mutations can lead to a very distinct variant, which causes far more infections. For example, Delta only really had 13 mutations, and it's been an extremely chaotic variant with high infection rates. Interestingly, Omicron had about 50 mutations, making it much more contagious than Delta, but not as high a hospitalization rate. So overall, I think we will continue to see mutations occur, and therefore the chances of a new variant is actually quite high.
And considering that Omicron, some early studies suggest Omicron is milder than the Delta variant, what would you say to those who are thinking about catching Omicron and maybe getting this all over with?
We have a surprising amount of data for this. So if we remember, the pox parties back in the day were when people gathered together to get this natural immunity against chickenpox for their kids. And they also did that for measles. So what did we learn from that? So one, we learned that in these pox parties per se, kids got more than just chickenpox and measles. They got sick from strep, staph infections, Hep B, along with many others. And the second and more important point was that children could and still can die from things like chickenpox and measles. So having exposure to these in a form which is better, which is a vaccination, is much safer than the idea there. So the idea of getting it over with an infection can be extremely dangerous.
All right, Dr. Raut, just about 30 seconds left here, but what are your thoughts on these booster shots being recommended for all Canadians?
Right now, what we know is adding a third dose increases the antibody titers by 25 times compared to 2 doses. And the impact of this is protection against getting COVID to up to 75% after the booster. But remember, boosters just force the virus to not produce as much, which means we may see less mutations as well.
The National Housing Strategy has released a new report produced through its Solutions Labs program. It recommends a progressive surtax on homes valued at over $1 million as a strategy to cool the housing market. Generation Squeeze founder Paul Kershaw, who authored the report with input from 80 experts, says an annual tax between 0.2 and 1% could play a key role in reducing housing inequality. The federal government says it won't introduce a tax on the equity of primary residences in Canada, but is tackling skyrocketing housing prices in other ways. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Paul Kershaw himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Now, so let's start with a quick overview of the current state of Canada's housing market, sir.
Well, if you think back to when my mom started in the housing market in the mid-1970s, it took the typical young adult 5 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average-priced home in this country, whether you're in Vancouver, GTA, or pretty much anywhere across the country. But if you flash forward to today, it now takes over 14 years of full-time work for that typical young person to save a 20% down payment on an average price home across Canada. It's more like 18 in Ontario, 20 in BC. I think it's 24 in the GTA now and 28 or so years in Metro Vancouver. So you have to start saving in childcare. And that's hard to do because childcare is often expensive. And what we're saying is, look, if we really want to restore affordability for all, we need home prices to stall so that earnings can catch up. And we're hoping we can get more and more Canadians agreeing with that logic. And then we can use every toolbox in our policy toolbox to try and achieve that goal going forward. And we're proposing something we know is controversial, a tax on home value over $1 million to help contribute to that end.
All right, sir. So tell us a little bit more about this proposed surtax and how it could help the situation.
Well, whether you're worried about reducing housing unaffordability or wealth inequality, we're saying it's time to protect real shelters, much more so than tax shelters. And your listeners might be wondering, what do you mean by a tax shelter? So for anyone who went to work today, 100% of their earnings is going to be subject to tax. If people use some of those earnings to invest in the stock market, 50% of their return on investment from the stock market would be subject to tax. But for anyone who's a homeowner like me, who has their wealth in their homes go up, barely any of that wealth is ever subject to tax. And the moment our policies turn our housing system into a strategy by which people can think, hey, I can get a really good return on investment that I shelter from taxation, we entangle everyday Canadians to bank on high and rising home prices for their wealth accumulation strategies. And that inclines us to be happy and hopeful that home prices will continue to rise and leave earnings behind. But by definition, we then bake in unaffordability for those who follow in our footsteps. And so this tax is trying to disrupt that way in which we entangle Canadians in hoping home prices will continue to rise and rise above $1 million.
All right, so how long would it take for the housing market to cool down if this surtax were to be implemented?
Well, the surtax in and of itself is unlikely to be a panacea, but so long as we tolerate this home ownership tax shelter, which is kind of, in many respects, akin to an offshore tax shelter. You know, when we have an offshore tax shelter, people move their money offshore to preserve assets. If we have a tax policy encouraging people to move their assets into wealth accumulation via housing, then we make housing a commodity and not just a place to call home. So we know that there would be a dampening influence right away. We'd have to see about how strong a price signal the tax would be, but the revenue we would raise would create about $5 billion a year that we could then invest in deeply affordable cooperative housing and purpose-built rental housing, which is increasingly what is in reach for young, hardworking, talented, well-educated people in our cities across the country.
All right, Dr. Kershaw, just about a minute left here, but another thing to consider is that the average national home price is just a bit over $720,000. So what about Canadians who can't afford homes under $1 million?
Brilliant. And our policy will have a kind of a downward slowing pressure on home prices generally. So hopefully it would kind of cool down the market, even below $1 million. But your point more generally is 90% of Canadians are not going to be subject to what we're proposing. They wouldn't pay a penny more. We're actually effectively asking the 10% of Canadians who live in the most affluent households in the country to show a kind of allegiance to the Canadian dream that a good home should be in reach for whatever someone can earn from hard work, whether in rental or co-op or maybe even in home ownership. And right now, the fact that we have this home ownership tax shelter that we protect and protect and protect, it is actually causing many others to be left on the outside looking in. And so we're wanting to say, let's show more allegiance to accessing real shelters than tax shelters.
All right, Dr. Kershaw, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
You're welcome. Have a great evening.
Stay with us. We'll be back after the break with a look at talks this week between Russia and NATO amid rising tensions over Ukraine. We'll have an interview with Mr. Bradley Bowman, Senior Director for the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily News. After some tense discussions, NATO and Russia have agreed to try to schedule more meetings about Ukraine's future. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says both parties expressed the need to dialogue and explore a schedule of future meetings, despite tensions over Moscow's military buildup near Ukraine. He says there are still significant differences between NATO allies and Russia on the issue, and he stressed that Ukraine has the right to decide its future security arrangements on its own. He also said that NATO would continue to leave the door open to new members. Well, with us now to unpack this situation is Bradley Bowman, the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Bowman, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Now, we know the issue of rising tensions between Russia and NATO is really not new, but can you outline this latest dispute to our viewers?
Absolutely. So what has essentially happened in the last few weeks or months has been that Russia has assembled approximately 100,000 combat forces on the borders of Ukraine. I mean, to Ukraine's north, to Ukraine's east, and also in the south in Crimea, which some of your viewers may recall is actually part of Ukraine that Russia illegally invaded and annexed in 2014. And we're not just, these are not just logistical personnel. These are combat troops. I'm talking about main battle tanks. I'm talking about infantry fighting vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems, everything that Vladimir Putin would need to conduct a major new invasion of Ukraine. What's his goal? His goal is, in my view, to bully Kyiv, to bully Ukraine. For what purpose? He wants them not to become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
All right, sir. Well, we know both sides, Russia and NATO, have agreed to further talks. What are the main points in the negotiations so far?
The main points are that, Vladimir Putin's objectives and the objectives of NATO, frankly, are at loggerheads. They're really in direct contradiction. And if we zoom out for a moment, really what's at stake here? In my view, what's at stake is two worldviews. A worldview of Vladimir Putin might makes right, that I'm powerful, I'm more powerful than you, and therefore I can tell you what to do, Ukraine. I can tell you what to do, Georgia. It's that worldview, which kind of sounds a little bit like the 19th century, doesn't it? And a worldview of territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and the rule of law. I mean, the question for your viewers is, should the people of Ukraine have the right to determine with whom they associate? That's the question. If you say no, and if you say that, then you're with Vladimir Putin, I would say. If you say yes, then you're with NATO. And so that's the core conflict. And so what has Vladimir Putin done? He's very shrewdly assembled this combat power around Ukraine, as I've said, to do what the late and former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz said, to cast a shadow of power over the negotiating table. At a minimum, he gets his concessions at the negotiating table, or he conducts the invasion. And he's been deliberately vague on that. His staffers are saying, oh, no, we're not interested. But then Vladimir Putin says, well, if we don't get what we want, we're going to have to pursue a, quote, military technical solution. We all know what that means.
Now, this is a very interesting tension point, sir. Considering NATO is a defensive alliance, why is Russia thinking the expansion of NATO would be a threat to it?
It's a good question. I would ask the same question. I would go further. I would state the following fact, is that NATO is not an offensive threat to Vladimir Putin. And I think he knows it. I understand the historical Russian sensibilities. I understand, we can talk about Napoleon's invasion. We can talk about World War II. I get it. But there is no desire on the part of the United States, our NATO allies, or Ukraine to threaten Russia. But here's the irony. Vladimir Putin's own actions are demonstrating the need for NATO, right? He has not done what he's done against the Baltic member states, which are members of NATO, because he knows that would have invoked the NATO treaty, the Article 5 commitment that an attack against one is attack against all. Instead, he went after Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. So he himself is making the case for everyone to see in Eastern Europe that, wow, NATO membership is value, and that makes Kyiv, that makes Ukraine want that membership all the more. So the problem is not Ukraine, in my view. The problem is the aggressive behavior of Vladimir Putin. And that's not an intellectual thing or a guess. That is history. That's 2014 Crimea invasion. He's his own worst enemy.
All right, Mr. Bowman, just about 30 seconds left here. But what do you expect from the next round of talks?
I think Vladimir Putin is going to see if he can accomplish his objectives at the negotiating table. So far, I'm glad to see that we're not giving in to these his demands, which I think would be betrayal of the core tenets of our democratic principles and the NATO alliance. And so it's ultimately come down to Vladimir Putin, and he may not know what he's going to do. But I think we have to help Ukraine have the capability to defend their country. And the more powerful Ukraine is, the less likely Putin is to come in and try to accomplish his political objectives with military force.
All right, sir. We'll definitely have to keep an eye on this developing situation. Mr. Bowman, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Up next, a conversation about Iran and Flight PS 752. Family members of those killed when Iran's military shot down a passenger jet 2 years ago are demanding the case go before the International Civil Aviation Organization and for the RCMP to launch a criminal investigation. The Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims is also calling for arrest warrants and government sanctions against senior Iranian political and military leaders and for the designation of Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. Nearly 140 of the 176 people killed in the January 8, 2020 incident had ties to Canada. And with us to discuss the sanctions and legal process is Ms. Sarah Teach. She is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a legal advisor to the coalition or the Canadian Coalition Against Terror. She is also one of the 5 legal advisors to the PS 752 Association. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, ma'am, so let's start with this. Can you briefly remind our viewers of the events leading to the downing of Flight PS 752?
Of course. So the downing of Flight PS 752 came amidst escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. It was on January 3rd, that's just 5 days before the crash, that Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by a U.S. drone strike. And less than 24 hours before the flight was downed by 2 missiles, the IRGC also attacked empty U.S. bases in Iraq. And then mere hours later, the 2 missiles were shot and downed Flight PS 752, killing everybody on board.
All right, ma'am. Well, we know the Ontario Superior Court recently ruled that the missile attacks were intentional and an act of terrorism. So what does that mean for the families of the victims?
So more than that, they actually also awarded compensation, including punitive damages. And to my knowledge, that's the first time that a superior court in Ontario has ever done that in a case of a terrorist act. So it's highly significant. Only a handful of families were involved in that civil lawsuit, but what it means for them is that Iranian assets in Canada, at least excluding diplomatic property, can be seized and sold, and the proceeds used to compensate family members. It also sets a precedent potentially for the other family members that were involved, and perhaps they could go to court as well.
And how has the Iranian government responded so far to this?
So this last week was the anniversary of the killing of Soleimani, the attack on the U.S. air bases, and the downing of Flight PS 752. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Iranian regime has focused on the former two and not focused on the downing of Flight PS 752. So what we saw most strikingly, perhaps, was that for the 2-year anniversary of the killing of Soleimani, Iran imposed sanctions on more U.S. officials.
All right, ma'am. Well, we mentioned the Ontario Superior Court's recent move, but what has the Canadian federal government done so far to address the attack?
Canada is part of a coordination and response group. So that includes not just Canada, but also Sweden, the UK, countries that had citizens on board the flight. So that group recently came out with a statement acknowledging that further negotiations with Iran would be futile and that next steps would be taken to seek accountability in international law. So hopefully then what comes next is those action steps precisely, with Canada in concert with these other countries seeking remedies using international law.
All right. Well, we mentioned that the association that's representing the families of the victims is calling for stronger action, including designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. So what is the significance of this, and is this a realistic ask?
For sure, it's realistic. It should have happened a long time ago. The Quds Force is already a listed terrorist entity in Canada. The Quds Force is the part of the IRGC that engages in clandestine operations abroad, funding terrorist proxies all over the region. So what this downing further proves, we already knew this, but what it shows is that the IRGC is also committing terrorist acts domestically in the airspace over Tehran. So certainly the entire IRGC should be listed.
All right. Well, just about a minute left in this interview, ma'am, but what are you watching for as this case progresses?
I'm watching for, the case to progress, for Canada to continue on those next steps that it's indicated that it will do. Watching for Canada to use international legal mechanisms to hold Iran to account and seek justice for the family members.
All right, just 30 seconds left in this interview, but where can our viewers go to learn more about the Canadian Coalition Against Terror?
CCAT has a website. There's also a Twitter. It's all over the internet. Check it out. As well, the PS 752 Association. I'd encourage interested viewers to check out their website and their Twitter. You could also follow me on Twitter, and I post regularly about both organizations.
Ms. Sarah Teach, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily's Week in Review, where we look at important conversations from the past week. Take care, Canada. Until next time.